He thought his story was ending, shovel in hand and no one to miss him. But as he carved earth for his grave, a little voice asked, "Can I hug you?" And with that, the end became a beginning. The shovel cut through dry earth with a slow, tired rhythm. Each thrust brought pain, but pain was something Everett Hart had learned to work with, not against. The morning sun hadn't yet broken over the ridge, and the sky still held the color of steel, dull and unfeeling. Everett's breath came in shallow puffs, not from the cold but from the disease that sat in his chest like a lead weight, chewing away at his strength day by day. There was a time he could have broken 10 horses before breakfast. Now a few feet of dirt left his hands shaking, his ribs aching. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the night they told him Lydia's womb would never carry life, and even then the tears never made it past his eyelids. They just sat there, hot and angry, until he blinked them back. Now she was gone, 3 winters passed, and what little strength he had left had no purpose to cling to. The land was still his, yes. The cabin still stood, though emptier by the day. But what was it worth with no one to hand it to? No child to raise in its walls, no hand to hold when the coughs came too fierce to stand against. No future left, only memory. And that was why, beneath the willow tree where Lydia used to sit reading aloud in the afternoons, Everett dug. Not out of despair exactly, but preparation. A quiet sort of surrender. He'd written the letter, left the deed to the land on the table, wrapped in oilskin so the dust wouldn't chew through it. He'd trimmed his beard, cleaned the stove, and fed the horses a little extra. Then he'd gone to the hill, took up the shovel, and started to carve the resting place he knew no one else would come to dig. He paused, letting the handle rest against his thigh, hand pressed to his side as another cough twisted through him. Red tinged the handkerchief. Not surprising, just confirmation. Then, just as he reached for the shovel again, he heard it. Not the wind. Not an animal. A voice. Tiny, cautious. Hello. Everett turned so fast he nearly lost his balance. His boots shifted in the loose dirt. He squinted toward the tree line at the far end of the pasture where the fence sagged and brush crept in wild. And there, standing barefoot, dress torn at the hem, tangled hair falling over her shoulders, stood a girl, no taller than the wheelbarrow, maybe 6 years old. She was alone. Too alone. "Who are you?" Everett rasped, the words cracking more from surprise than sickness. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked to the shovel, then to the shallow hole behind him, then to the cross he'd carved days ago in the bark of the willow. And though she was a child, there was something too knowing in her gaze. "Are you dying?" she asked softly. Everett opened his mouth to answer but found no words, just air. The girl took a step forward, hands clutched in front of her like she was trying not to shiver. Her dress was filthy, her knees scraped, but she wasn't crying, not yet. "I got lost," she said. "We were in a wagon then. Men came, they were yelling. Mama screamed, I ran." Her voice quivered. "I kept running." Everett lowered the shovel slowly. A knot twisted in his chest. Not just pity, something more ancient, protective, dangerous. "You alone?" he asked. She nodded. "Anyone chasten you?" Another nod, then a whisper, "But I think I lost them." Silence fell thick as dust. Everett glanced toward the cabin, his grave, then back at the girl. He hadn't been around children in years. Not since Lydia tried so hard to bring one home. But the way the girl stood, torn and trembling yet trying so hard to be brave, it felt like someone had jammed a red-hot nail into the center of his chest. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked. "Josie." He exhaled slowly, eyes on her scraped hands. "Well, Josie, you got somewhere to go." She shook her head. "You hungry?" She hesitated, then gave the slightest nod. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Come on." Josie followed without hesitation, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Everett Hart turned away from the grave he'd been digging and walked back toward the cabin, this time with a shadow following close behind. Inside, he lit the stove, put on the kettle, and found the last apple Lydia had pickled the year she passed. Josie sat at the table, hands folded neatly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch anything. He poured hot water over dried tea leaves, sliced the apple in careful quarters and set them before her. "Eat slow," he said. She nodded and did exactly that. An hour passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Everett watched her out of the corner of his eye, how she cradled the tin cup with both hands, how her lips moved while she chewed, like she was whispering to someone who wasn't there. "You sure there's no one coming after you?" he asked again. Josie's face darkened. They had knives. Everett's jaw clenched. And then she asked, out of nowhere, "Is that where you were gonna sleep?" He followed her gaze. She was looking through the window, back toward the grave. He didn't answer. Josie climbed down from the chair, walked across the room, and stood in front of him. She was so small, dirt on her cheeks, leaves in her hair, but her eyes were wide with something fierce. Not fear, not anymore. She reached up and touched the edge of his sleeve. "Can I hug you?" Everett froze. No one had touched him in 3 years. His arms moved before he even told them to. Josie wrapped herself around him like she'd been doing it her whole life, like the world hadn't torn itself to pieces behind her. Her breath was warm against his chest. And Everett Hart, widower, dying man, half a grave already dug, felt something flicker inside him that he thought had long gone cold. Hoping. Everett didn't sleep much that night. The fire crackled low in the hearth, and the cabin creaked with its usual chorus of old beams and settling walls, but the sound that kept him up wasn't the wind or the distant call of coyotes. It was breathing. Soft, rhythmic breathing from the girl curled beneath the quilt in the corner bed, tucked so tightly against the wall that her small frame barely made a rise in the blankets. She hadn't stirred once since he laid her down. Not even when he'd awkwardly patted her shoulder with a muttered, "Sleep, then." Not even when he sat in the old rocking chair Lydia once used and stared at the glowing embers until his eyes blurred. That breath, that presence, reminded him there was now a reason to wake up. Come morning, the sky broke open in a burnished gold, and snowmelt ran in thin rivulets along the hillsides. Everett moved slowly, his joints stiff, body aching in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the cancer that had taken up residence in his bones like a stubborn squatter. He didn't expect to live long enough to see another season change. But the moment his boots hit the floor, and he heard that steady, even breath from Josie's corner, his mind shifted. He stoked the fire, fried an egg, the last from the coop out back, and laid it beside a thick heel of cornbread. He set the plate quietly by the bed, not waking her, just watching, just remembering what it meant to have someone else to cook for, even if it was only a child dropped into his life by chance and chaos. She stirred not long after, yawned, blinked, and smiled. Everett wasn't ready for the way that smile felt, cracking through the morning like sunlight through frost. "Morning," she said. He nodded once. "Eat." She did, every bite, no hesitation. It wasn't just hunger, it was training. A girl who'd learned not to waste, not to question. That look in her eye when she cleaned her plate wasn't joy, it was survival. After she finished, Josie wandered to the doorway and stood with her hands pressed to the frame, staring out at the rolling hills beyond the ranch. She didn't ask about the grave. She didn't mention yesterday's tears or who she'd run from. Instead, she asked, "What do you do here?" Everett cleared his throat. "Used to run cattle, raise some feed, trade eggs and milk at the supply depot 2 days east." She turned to him, brow scrunched, "But not now." He stared into his empty coffee cup. "Not for a while." Josie nodded slowly, like she understood more than she should. Then, after a pause, she asked, "Can I stay a little while?" Everett didn't answer right away. His throat felt tight. He wanted to say no, not because he didn't want her here, but because he didn't trust himself to be anything useful anymore. What could a dying man give a child except grief when he left? Still, she was standing in his doorway like she belonged there, and the cabin didn't feel so cold this morning. "Few days," he said quietly, "just until we figure things out." Josie beamed, "Okay." And that was that. They settled into a routine that week. Everett taught her how to collect eggs from the henhouse without spooking the birds, how to pat down the firewood pile to check for spiders before hauling it inside. She listened closely, asked questions in a quiet but curious voice, and always said thank you when he handed her something. A mug of warm milk, a piece of bread, a patched blanket. She also sang. Not loudly, not like children who'd been loved loudly often did, but soft and broken tunes that had no real words, just hums stitched together like old memories. Each time she did, Everett sat a little straighter. One night when the wind howled like wolves and the storm rolled heavy down from the mountains, Josie startled from sleep. She didn't scream, didn't cry, but she sat up quick and wide-eyed, clutching the quilt like it might disappear. Everett heard it from his bed, the way she whispered, "Mama." He rose, slow and stiff, crossing the room and kneeling beside her. "You all right?" he asked, voice rough with sleep. She nodded quickly, then shook her head. "I heard her scream." Everett's hand hovered above her shoulder, uncertain. Josie sniffled. "She told me to run, but I couldn't hear if she was still screaming after I did." There it was, the pain beneath the surface, the wound no amount of cornbread or chores could fix. "I think she wanted me to run," Josie added, almost apologetically. "I didn't want to leave her, but she pushed me. She told me to go." Everett nodded slowly. "Then she gave you the only gift a mother could." Josie looked up at him, eyes brimming but not spilling. "What gift?" He finally let his hand settle on her shoulder, firm but gentle. "A chance." For a long time she didn't speak, just leaned into his hand, breathing slowly until her eyelids fluttered again. When she drifted off, Everett didn't move for a long while. He sat there beside the tiny bundle of warmth and sorrow and listened to her breath, steady, alive. And he realized he hadn't thought about his grave in 2 full days. By the end of the week, Everett had moved her cot closer to the stove and dug out Lydia's old sewing box to stitch a proper hem on Josie's dress. She wore it proudly the next morning, spinning once in the sunlight and asking if she looked like someone new. "You look like someone strong," Everett said, and meant it. But that morning, as he leaned against the porch rail and watched her chase a butterfly near the fence, a pain deep in his ribs stole his breath. He doubled over slightly, clutching his side. The cough came hard, dragging his frame to one knee. Blood again. More than before. Josie didn't see it. He wiped it fast, hid the rag under his coat. But something inside him said he was running out of time. That night he wrote a letter, not to a lawyer, not to a bank, just a name he remembered from Lydia's past, a woman who'd once tried to adopt but had been turned away for reasons Everett couldn't recall. A kind woman, someone trustworthy. He wrote her name, then Josie's, asked for a favor he didn't know would be honored. And then he folded the page and placed it in the top drawer of Lydia's old writing desk. He watched Josie sleep a long time that night, wondered how she'd ended up here, why she'd found his hill, what purpose she'd carried in her small, wild steps. And why, since the day she arrived, the grave he'd been digging felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. 2 weeks after Josie arrived, the shovel leaned untouched in the corner of Everett's shed, the hole on the back hill half filled with meltwater and fallen leaves. He hadn't gone back up there since the night she found him digging. Every morning he told himself he would. Every evening, the ache in his side reminded him why he started. But each day in between, something else kept pulling his feet toward the barn, toward the fence line, toward the girl humming to herself while brushing the horse or coaxing the old mule to eat clover from her palm. It was a strange thing, watching life move forward when you were certain it was ending. She didn't ask questions about the pain, not when she saw him double over while splitting wood, not when his hand trembled lifting a pail. She just adjusted quietly, took smaller loads herself, chopped carrots before he could reach for the knife, set the kettle on the fire without being told. She filled in the empty spaces like rain soaking into cracked earth, slow and silent, but changing everything it touched. On the 15th day, she built him a scarecrow. He found it leaning sideways in the middle of his fallow field, wearing an old hat of his and Lydia's torn shawl as a cape. Josie stood beside it with her arms crossed, face serious. "This field's empty," she said, as if that explained everything. Everett raised an eyebrow. "So you gave it company?" She nodded. Nobody should be alone that long, even dirt. That night he laughed for the first time in over a year. A real laugh, short, cracked at the edges but real. The days grew longer. They mended fence lines, cleared brush, and hauled buckets from the stream. Josie found 2 stray kittens near the shed and declared them hers. Everett grumbled but built a crate with old planks and set it beside the hearth. They grew used to each other's rhythms. The silence that settled in mid-afternoon when the world slowed, the way Josie read aloud in the evenings without asking if he minded. Sometimes he caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, studying him, measuring him maybe. On the 19th day, Everett woke with a cough that didn't stop for nearly a minute. When he finally caught his breath, he saw her standing in the doorway, face pale. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, but his hand was stained red. He saw her see it. She didn't flinch, just crossed the room and set her little hand over his firm. "You're sick," she said, and there was no accusation in her voice. No fear, just truth. "Been for a while." "Are you dying?" He hesitated. Her eyes searched his. "I want to know." He sat back against the wall, breath still shallow. "Doctors think so." Josie blinked once. "Do you think so?" He looked past her out the window where the sun lit the fence line gold. "I used to, every day." "And now?" Everett didn't answer, not right away. Instead, he reached out and brushed a loose curl from her forehead. "Now I'm not sure. You make dying feel a whole lot less urgent." That night she asked if he'd teach her how to fish. They walked to the river the next morning, poles in hand, silence stretching between them like a shared coat. Everett showed her how to thread the hook, how to watch the line for movement. Josie listened, nodded, asked questions when she didn't understand. She caught 2 fish before he caught one. "Beginner's luck," he muttered. Josie grinned. "Or maybe you're just out of practice." They cooked them on an open flame, sitting on flat stones by the river's edge, toes dangling in the cold water. "You miss someone?" she asked between bites. Everett nodded. "My wife." "What was her name?" "Lydia." "Was she pretty?" He chuckled. "I thought so." "What did she smell like?" That caught him. He blinked. "Lavender and pine. She used to tuck little satchels in our pillowcases." Josie nodded, satisfied. "My mom smelled like bread." That evening, Everett opened Lydia's hope chest for the first time in years. Josie stood beside him, silent as he unfolded old letters, a faded shawl, a photo of a younger him beside a woman with kind eyes. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. Josie leaned her head against his arm. "I think I would have liked her too." The next week brought windstorms. Wild and fast-moving, they knocked out fence lines and scattered kindling across the field. Everett strained more than he should have, coughed more, woke more often at night with cold sweats and shaking hands. Josie tried not to show how much she noticed, but Everett saw it in the way she kept glancing at him, in the sudden hugs, the way her tiny arms would wrap around his waist out of nowhere. On the 24th night, he woke to her crying softly. He knelt by her bed. "What is it?" "I don't want you to die," she whispered. "I know." She wiped her nose. "I don't want to go anywhere else." Everett swallowed hard. "You don't have to." I don't have a real home. You do now. She reached up and touched his face, tiny fingers against his beard. Can I call you Papa? Everett felt the world tilt beneath him, not from sickness, not from grief, from something that broke and mended at the same time. He nodded, and Josie smiled, curled into him and fell asleep. That morning Everett lit a fire and sat with his coffee longer than usual. He didn't touch the shovel in the shed, didn't glance up the hill. Instead, he took Josie's hand and walked with her to town. For the first time in years, he wanted to be seen. Wanted someone to witness the fact that Everett James, widower of a childless marriage, had someone worth protecting now. He spoke to the preacher, spoke to the doctor, asked questions about legal guardianship, about naming heirs, about care and contingency. He asked about hope. The doctor gave him a look. It's not about how long you've got, he said. It's what you do with what's left. Everett took that home and thought about it all evening, while Josie chased fireflies in the yard. And later, when she sat beside him on the porch and leaned into his arm, she asked, "Are you scared?" He didn't lie, sometimes. "But I'm here now," she said. He nodded, "Yes, you are." And for the first time since he stood over an open grave with a shovel in his hand, Everett felt like tomorrow might be worth waking up for. The wind was softer now. Even when it pressed against the windows or made the old barn door creak on its hinges, it didn't sound so much like a threat, more like a reminder. Life was still moving. The seasons would turn. And for now, Everett James had someone to tether him to the ground. Each morning began the same. Josie would wake first, already sitting by the hearth with the kittens tucked in her lap or halfway dressed and trying to braid her own hair. Everett, slower by the day, still found the strength to smile when he saw her there, as if the world hadn't come undone after all. But his strength wasn't returning, not really. The pain shifted like a stubborn root in his chest. Sometimes it faded, sometimes it flared so sharp he'd grip the edge of the table till his knuckles whitened. He never cried out, not once, but Josie saw, and she knew. Still, they kept moving. She learned to chop kindling with slow, careful swings. She learned to feed the animals and check the troughs, to brush down the mule and count the hens, to stir stew with one hand and red with the other. She could write her name now. She practiced every day in the dust on the floor, Josie James. One afternoon, Everett sat on the porch, blanket draped across his knees, and watched her draw it again and again on a scrap of cloth. "You like the sound of that?" he asked, voice gravel-soft. Josie nodded without looking up. "I do." It was the first time she had spoken her new last name aloud. She said it again, trying out the shape in her mouth, then looked up. "Do I really get to keep it?" "You don't have to earn it," Everett said. "You already did. Day you knocked on my soul and didn't let me shut the door again." Josie didn't answer. She didn't have to. She leaned against his arm and sat quiet, her hand in his. But they both knew time was shifting. The doctor's words lingered, not how long but how well. Everett had days where he could move almost normal. Others, he couldn't climb the stairs without seeing stars. He didn't tell Josie everything, but she pieced enough together. Her eyes always watched. Her heart always listened. One evening she left a drawing on his pillow. It was a house, a big one with smoke curling from the chimney. Two figures stood in front, a tall man with a wide hat and a small girl in a pink dress. The caption beneath read, "Me and Papa, forever." Everett pressed the paper to his chest and let himself weep silently into the quilt Lydia had once sewn. Spring thundered in with flash floods. The river swelled, rising to the barn's lower beams. Everett and Josie worked fast, piling sandbags, moving the feed higher. He overexerted himself, nearly passed out from the pain. Josie helped him into the chair, her small face tight with fear she tried to hide. "You promised," she whispered that night as he coughed into a rag. "You said I didn't have to go anywhere else." He cupped her cheek, thin fingers trembling. You won't. The next day he rode into town. It was the first time he'd taken the wagon in weeks. Josie sat beside him, clutching her drawing. She wore her cleanest dress and a ribbon in her hair. Everett wore his old Sunday coat. It no longer fit quite right around the shoulders, but he buttoned it anyway. At the courthouse he spoke to the magistrate, laid out his case. A man with little time left, a girl with nowhere to go. The world called it a burden. Everett called it grace. Paperwork takes time, the clerk muttered. You don't have much of that, do you? Everett didn't answer. He only rested a hand on Josie's shoulder. She stood tall. We'll wait, she said. The doctor stepped in, signed affidavits. The preacher added his signature too. Word had spread by now. Folks who once ignored Everett on market days gave him solemn nods now. Some even dropped off food. Others simply smiled when they saw Josie's hand in his. They became a story, one of those whispered kind, about loss and love and something that bloomed even after the soil turned dry. Back at the ranch, the days shortened again. Summer winds lost their bite. Josie ran through the fields chasing fireflies. Everett sat on the porch and watched her dance in the light of dusk, knowing he couldn't keep pace anymore. But he didn't need to. He had already walked farther than he ever expected to. One night, as the stars blinked awake above them, Josie climbed into his lap without a word. She wrapped her arms around his chest, careful not to squeeze too tight. Then she looked up. Do you think she sees us? Who? Everett asked, though he already knew. Your wife. He looked at the sky, at the wild scattering of stars. I think she never stopped. Do you think she's proud of me? He looked down at her, eyes misted. I think she's proud of both of us. The papers arrived in a creased envelope. Finalized, stamped, legal. The girl was his now in name, in heart, in everything but blood. Everett folded the document and placed it on the mantel, but he didn't need the words. He'd already heard the only ones that mattered. Papa. As days bled into one another, Everett's world got smaller. Some mornings he could only make it as far as the porch, others only to the table, but Josie stayed. She brought him water, covered him with the shawl, told him stories, some real, some imagined, all of them beautiful. On the 64th morning since she came, Everett didn't rise. Josie found him seated by the window, looking out across the fence line. His eyes were open. His hand rested over his chest, where her drawing had been tucked the night before. But he was cold. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, not at first. She sat beside him, small hands slipping into his. Then she whispered something. I'll take care of everything, I promise. The preacher found her hours later, still holding his hand. They buried Everett on the back hill, under the tree that bloomed first every spring. Josie stood in a white dress, the ribbon still in her hair. She didn't speak during the service. She just stared up at the sky, as if waiting for some sign. And maybe she got it. A breeze picked up. A single blossom drifted from the tree, landing in her open palm. The preacher knelt beside her. You're not alone, he said softly. I know, she replied. He told me that once. She didn't leave the ranch. Folks offered, but she refused. Instead, she lived there, grew there, tended the land, raised animals, opened the gates to other children who had nowhere to go. She named the place after the scarecrow he helped her build all those months ago, the Field of Company. And every spring, beneath the first blossoms of the back hill tree, she laid a new flower for Everett James, the man who once dug a grave, and instead found a reason to live. Winter came again, not with cruelty but with memory. The same way an old song might return through a crackling radio, or the way the scent of bread could pull a man years backward into his mother's kitchen. For Josie, it arrived with the slow hush of snow across the fields and the creak of the porch wood beneath her growing boots. She was taller now, nearly 7, with her hair often pulled into 2 neat braids she did herself. but the porch chair she sat in each evening was still Everett's, worn into the exact shape of him, as though the man had merely gone to town and would be back any moment. She kept his hat on a hook beside the door. His boots were still near the hearth, cleaned once a week, polished though no foot would fill them again. Some things deserved to be remembered. The townsfolk had learned to stop calling her the girl who lived with the dying man. That name had faded. She had earned a better one, Miss Josie James of Field of Company Ranch. She was small, but her word was law on the property. She knew how to break ice in the troughs, how to settle colts when they kicked too wild, how to stitch a tear in a coat, and how to stack firewood so it wouldn't fall when the wind howled. More than that, she knew how to listen. That was the rarest gift of all. The first boy she brought in was no older than she'd been the day she met Everett. His name was Tobias. Found him sleeping in the empty loft of the old mill with bruises down one arm and a cough that rattled his ribs. Josie brought him bread first, then a blanket, then her voice. "You can come with me. It's warm where I live." He didn't speak for 3 days. Then one morning he followed her to the barn without being asked. He never left. After Tobias came June and Ellie, sisters whose mother had perished during a river crossing, and whose uncle had been lost long before anyone thought to check on them. They arrived clutching each other's hands, and left that first night clinging to Josie's coat as though it were the only real thing in the world. She didn't promise safety. She only offered company. And that was enough. The ranch grew in ways Everett never saw with his eyes but certainly felt with his spirit. More children arrived. Some stayed a month. Others never left. Josie kept a small drawer full of things they gave her, notes, buttons, bits of ribbon, all carried like treasure. She still visited Everett's grave every week. She brought whatever the land offered, apple blossoms, pine cones, sometimes just a smooth stone. She sat, told him stories, or sat in silence. And when she didn't know what to say, she said, "Thank you." That always seemed like enough. But peace, no matter how strong its walls, always heard knocking. It was near dusk one day when a rider approached the fence line. Josie was working with June to patch a saddle when the dog barked twice, low and unfamiliar. She stood, wiped her hands, and narrowed her eyes toward the horizon. A tall man dismounted. Not young, not old. Gray dust coated his boots and sleeves. He removed his hat respectfully, pausing at the gate. "You Josie James?" "Yes," she said, cautious. "I was told this was your place." "Depends who told you." He stepped closer, not threatening but heavy somehow, like a man who carried something long overdue. "My name's Charles. I knew Everett years back." Josie didn't move, but her jaw tensed. "You're the one who didn't come," she said quietly. He looked ashamed. "I wasn't ready to say goodbye to him." "That wasn't your decision to make." "I know." They stood in silence. Chickens clucked from the side yard. The wind twisted a loose shutter against the barn. "I came to apologize," he said, "and to return something." He pulled from his coat a folded letter. The edges were softened with time, but the seal was unbroken. Everett's name was written across it in ink faded to rust. "I never sent it. Coward's heart, I guess, but maybe it belongs here, to you now." Josie took it, fingers trembling slightly. She did not open it. "Instead," she said, "he forgave you. He forgave everyone. That's just who he was." "I never stopped thinking of him," Charles whispered. "Never." "I didn't either," she said, then added, "but I live for him now. That's different." Charles asked if he could stay a night. Josie let him sleep in the old guest room, the one Everett had never used but always kept swept. In the morning, Charles rode on without saying where. He left behind a bag of feed and an old harmonica. She placed both by the hearth. That winter was harder. The snow stayed longer. Several of the younger children fell sick with a fever that swept through the valley. Josie barely slept, moving from room to room with wet cloths and spoonfuls of broth, whispering songs she only half remembered from her own childhood. One boy nearly didn't make it. When he finally opened his eyes, weak but alive, he said, "I dreamed a man was watching me. He had kind eyes and an old hat." Josie smiled. "He still checks on us," she said, "even now." In the spring, she opened the back pasture and planted saplings near the tree Everett rested under. One for every child who'd come to her. Dozens of small markers, some with names, others blank. She carved them herself, slow and careful, the way Everett had once carved that scarecrow's smile. One evening, Tobias asked her, "What happens when you're gone?" She looked at the trees, at the house, at the boots by the fire still standing as if Everett might come back. "I hope someone says what I said when I found this place." "What's that?" "I'm not alone anymore." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, thunder cracked. Josie stood, hands at her side. Her hair danced around her shoulders. Her voice was soft but sure. "This land remembers everyone who needed it, and it always has room for one more." And then she turned back to the house, to the warmth, to the table filled with laughter, to the boots no longer waiting for anyone, because someone had already filled them. Spring rolled into summer like a wave that refused to break, long, slow, and heavy with heat. The days stretched wider on the ranch now, and Josie worked harder than most grown men. Not because she had to, but because that's what Everett would have done. And maybe, more than anything, because keeping busy kept her upright on the hard days, the quiet ones. The ones when no new shoes rested by the porch. No knock on the door. Just the sound of her own breathing, the rustle of trees, the beat of the sun overhead. The land around Field of Company Ranch had grown green again, like it had forgiven the past winters, as if even sorrow had to loosen its grip eventually. Grass stretched tall and thick near the creek, and the wild colts born in the spring were already nosing fence posts and testing the length of their legs. Josie had names for each of them. Dee learned long ago that things lived longer when you called them something. She learned that from Everett. Just like she learned that sometimes, the smallest hands carried the heaviest stories. Most nights, the kitchen table filled with noise and mismatched cutlery. Tobias, older now and tall enough to reach the upper barn beams, liked to challenge the other boys to races along the fencing rails. Ellie and June still shared a bed, even though 2 rooms now stood open. They said the dark felt softer when they were near each other. New children had arrived too, a quiet girl with a crooked smile named Ruthie, and a boy who never spoke but slept with his face buried in a worn book he couldn't read. They never asked where the children came from. Josie only asked where they wanted to go. Some stayed. Some moved on with the mail wagons or with teachers headed west. But the door always stayed open. The boots by the fire always had a second pair waiting beside them. One day, while mending a section of the barn roof, Josie spotted smoke on the horizon. Thin but steady. A column rising from the east, too small for a wildfire, too straight for a camp. She narrowed her eyes, heart picking up. She didn't mention it that night, but the next morning she saddled one of the calmer horses and rode out. The prairie was quiet, the heat pressing down like an invisible weight, but her mind wouldn't stop circling the same question. Who would be that far out, with no town, no trail, and nothing to keep company but ghosts? It took hours to reach the source. What she found wasn't a campfire or an accident, but a wagon, broken, sun-beaten, and abandoned save for the figure of a girl no older than 4 curled beneath its axle. She didn't cry when Josie approached. She didn't move either, just stared with wide, scorched eyes, her cheeks hollow and streaked with ash. Josie knelt slowly. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're not alone." The child blinked once, twice, then reached out with one filthy hand and touched Josie's sleeve. It was the only answer she needed. Josie carried the girl home wrapped in her shawl. When the child finally spoke 3 days later, it was only to ask, "Do I get a name here?" "You get whatever name you want," Josie said, and the girl smiled like maybe the world wasn't so cruel after all. The fields turned gold again by autumn, and with them came a letter, sealed in wax and worn at the corners. The handwriting was uneven but familiar. Charles, the man who'd once brought Everett's letter and stayed just one night. It said only, "I've got a boy who needs a start. I thought of you. I'll bring him before the frost sets in, if you'll have him." Josie folded the note carefully. She didn't need to answer. Charles would know the door was open. When the boy arrived, he was 10 and already bruised by more than time. He wouldn't speak. He barely ate. But Josie gave him chores anyway, mended his shirts and left clean socks at the foot of his bed. The others welcomed him in the only way they knew, by pretending he'd always been there. It took 3 weeks before he joined the others by the fire. Another 2 before he laughed. And one strange night, as the wind blew cold from the mountains, he looked at Josie and whispered, "Is it true this place used to be his?" "Who?" "Everett, the one who made all this." Josie smiled softly. "It was his," she said, "and now it's yours." There were days she still missed him so fiercely she could hardly breathe. When she thought of the way he held the shovel that morning she met him, the dirt loose in piles like he didn't care where the pieces of him were buried. And how strange, how powerful it was that he never finished the whole. That a hug from a girl in tattered socks had filled something that death never could. Sometimes in the stillness of early dawn, Josie walked to that same spot behind the pasture, the one Everett had chosen to dig. His headstone wasn't much, just a square of cedar he'd carved himself when his hands still worked smooth. But it was enough. She'd talk to him sometimes, tell him about Ruthie learning to whistle, about how Tobias nearly got kicked by the same mule 3 times in 1 week, about the barn roof leaking again and how Charles wrote to say he might come back through for good. "You wouldn't believe it," she said one morning, sitting cross-legged in the dew-wet grass. "You thought you were dying, but you were the start of everything." She leaned back, hands in the soil. "I didn't save you, Everett James. You saved me, and now I get to pass it on." The leaves rustled. A crow called once from the fence post. Somewhere behind her the breakfast bell rang. And Josie stood, brushed off her dress, and walked back to the house full of children who'd all come from silence and stayed for hope. But not one of them ever left empty. The first snow came early that year. Not the heavy kind that locked gates and buried fence posts, but the soft kind, gentle flurries drifting sideways, as if the sky itself was exhaling slow. Josie stood on the porch wrapped in her thickest shawl, coffee going cold in her hand, watching the flakes settle on the railing. The house behind her was already stirring, full of quiet footsteps and whispered giggles. Someone was burning toast again. She smiled without turning. The ranch was full now, fuller than it had ever been, even in Everett's time. More than a dozen children lived within the weathered walls of Field of Company Ranch, and yet somehow it never felt crowded. Each one carved space around themselves without pushing others out. It wasn't about square footage or beds. It was about belonging, and every last one of them did. The boy Charles brought, his name was Eli, had finally begun to speak again. Not in full sentences, but in enough syllables to let Josie know he dreamed of being a blacksmith one day. He had strong hands for a 10-year-old, and he'd taken to helping with the tools in the shed, polishing horseshoes, learning the balance of hammers and nails. Josie made no promises, but she let him work. That was enough. Tobias, nearly 15 now, was taller than any of them and helped shoulder the bulk of the winter prep. He built a new chicken coop by hand, fixed the back fence with old cedar, and was even trusted with the ledger, writing down feed orders in his square, careful handwriting. He still sat with Josie some nights, not to ask questions anymore, but just to sit. Ellie and June, inseparable since day one, had become little shadows of Josie herself. They led the younger children through their lessons, stitched up torn hems, and always remembered to leave an extra biscuit on the counter for anyone who might be too shy to ask for seconds. Ruthie now wore her hair in long braids and carried a wooden whistle around her neck. She said it helped her feel brave. She carved it herself with Tobias' help, and sometimes when the wind was quiet, You could hear her practicing behind the barn, little tunes that sounded half like birdsong, half like prayer. And Josie kept going. She still woke with the ache in her shoulder Everett used to kiss better, still caught herself turning to tell him something only to remember he wasn't there. But she never felt alone, not really, because pieces of him lingered in every nail he'd hammered, in every saddle he'd oiled, and most of all in the way he used to listen, really listen. She tried to do the same. And it was listening that let her hear it on the edge of that quiet winter morning, the sound of hooves, not wild, not urgent, but steady. Josie stepped down from the porch, heart ticking just a little faster. A rider emerged through the low haze of snowfall, bundled in a brown coat and dust-covered hat. It was Charles again. He dismounted slowly, favoring one side as if he'd taken a bad fall recently. Josie noticed his hands were empty this time. No child at his side. No boy needing a start. Just a letter tucked in the pocket of his coat. "Long ride?" Josie asked. "Longer than I planned," he said, voice raspier than she remembered. "Figured it was time." "Time for what?" He reached into his coat, pulled out the envelope and held it toward her. She took it carefully. The handwriting was neater this time, stronger. "From Everett." Charles nodded once. "He gave it to me that morning, said to wait, said I'd know when." Josie blinked fast but didn't open it just yet. She looked up, eyes locking with Charles's. "You staying for supper?" "I was hoping to." "Then your family." Inside, the children were preparing supper. There was flour on the floor, laughter in the rafters, and a pie burning somewhere in the oven. Josie placed the letter on the mantel and joined them without reading it. Not yet. Because some letters didn't need to be opened right away. Some were just better held for when the house was still and the fire burned low. When the noise of the day had slipped into the past, and all that was left was the hum of the wind and the memory of a man who'd once started to dig a grave but ended up planting a home instead. And later that night, when all the children had drifted to sleep, Josie unsealed the letter. Inside, in Everett's shaky but determined hand, it said only this: "If you're reading this, then I was wrong. You see, Josie, I thought I'd run out of time. I thought the end had already come, but you turned it into a beginning. You always did have that in you. Love, Everett." Josie folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. Her eyes burned, but her heart was warm, not just with memory, but with something stronger, something present. She looked around the quiet house, the gentle breathing of the children, the embers of the fire, and knew. Everett wasn't gone. He was here. In every footstep, every voice, every hug passed down like a second chance. And as she turned off the last lamp, she whispered into the dark, "You didn't die, Everett. You multiplied." The ranch house stood quiet under the weight of the night, its windows glowing faintly against the velvet dark. Inside, embers snapped softly in the hearth, throwing long shadows across wooden floors that had once echoed with nothing but silence. Now they bore the soft prints of new life, bare feet, little shoes, half-dragged blankets, reminders of motion, of return, of something sacred being rebuilt in pieces. Josie sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug long since gone cold. The letter from Everett lay open before her, and though the words were few, they burned deeper than any sermon. She read it again, then a third time. Each pass brought new meaning, like how scripture bends and stretches depending on the season of your heart. Everett had left this world expecting to disappear, but something had changed in those last hours. Charles must have seen it, the shift, the second thought, the hope that hadn't been there before. Josie turned her head slightly at the sound of footsteps, too light to be grown. Ruthie appeared in the archway, eyes squinting, hair mussed by sleep. She clutched the wooden whistle she always kept with her, the one Tobias had helped carve. "Bad dream?" Josie asked. Ruthie nodded and padded over, crawling up onto Josie's lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. No words passed between them for a long moment. Just warmth and breathing and the shared space of wakefulness in a sleeping house. "Are you gonna go away too?" Ruthie asked quietly. Josie blinked. "Go where?" "Wherever it went." The question sat heavy in the room like dust stirred from the corners of a church pew. Josie looked down at Ruthie's tiny hand on her arm, felt the pulse beneath her skin, and understood what the girl wasn't asking. She wasn't talking about heaven. She was talking about leaving, emotionally, physically, spiritually, like so many adults before Josie had come along. "No, baby," Josie whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Ruthie laid her head against Josie's chest, listening to the heartbeat like it was proof. Maybe it was. Later that morning, the house slowly rumbled to life. The smell of biscuits filled the air, real ones, not the burned hockey pucks from the week before. Tobias had taken to cooking with precision lately, determined to get it right. Ellie and June directed the younger kids through morning chores, while Charles repaired a fence rail with Eli out back. Josie watched it all from the porch, Everett's coat draped across her shoulders even though the morning was warm. A small sound pulled her attention left. A wagon was approaching, slower than most, drawn by a tired old mule that had clearly seen better decades. Josie squinted into the sun and saw a young woman at the reins, thin and taut like someone who hadn't eaten a full meal in weeks. Behind her, tucked in the back of the wagon, were two children. One older boy, maybe 7, clutching a smaller girl to his chest. They weren't laughing, they weren't crying either. They were just watching. Josie stood, walked to the gate as the wagon came to a halt. The woman climbed down, boots worn clean through at the heel. She nodded once, eyes bloodshot but dry. "Field of company?" she asked. Josie nodded. "Name's Rachel. These two are my niece and nephew. Lost their folks 3 weeks back. Been bouncing from town to town, looking for somewhere that didn't have a no on its lips." Josie didn't ask for the details. She never did anymore. Pain came in too many flavors to measure. Instead, she stepped forward, opened the gate wide and reached out a hand. "You're home." The boy's name was Caleb. The girl was Miri. They didn't speak much at first, but that didn't matter. The other children folded them into their days like pages in a journal. No questions, no lines, just inclusion. Miri took to Ruthie fast, both of them full of silent watchfulness, while Caleb shadowed Tobias like he was a soldier apprenticing to a general. A week passed, then 2. And on the 3rd Saturday, Josie found herself sitting on the porch steps beside Charles again, both of them watching the children play. "You ever think he knew?" Charles asked suddenly. "Knew what?" "That this," he gestured toward the house, the yard, the dozen kids chasing each other barefoot, was what come from it. Josie considered that. She thought of Everett, of his hands, his scars, the way he used to stare at the sky like he was trying to hear something no one else could. She thought of his silence when they'd learned the truth, that no children would ever bear their name. And she thought of the hole he dug in the middle of that wind-streaked field, where instead of ending his life, he found a little girl needing one. "He hoped," she said finally, even when he couldn't believe he hoped. Charles nodded like that was enough. The next day brought mail, actual mail, envelopes from neighboring towns, one stamped in red ink marked urgent. Josie opened it at the table while the children ate stew. It was from a reverend over in Limestone Hollow, begging for help. A church orphanage had been burned down in a lightning storm, and 12 children had nowhere to go, half of them sick, all of them afraid. Josie didn't blink. She folded the letter, tucked it into the ledger, and called Tobias over. "We're going to need more beds." "More?" he asked, eyebrows rising. "More." He smiled, shook his head, and set to work. By sundown, new mattresses were being dragged down from the loft, fresh quilts shaken out, and a pot of soup large enough to feed a mining camp was bubbling on the stove. Ellie, June, and Caleb started making name tags, while Miri helped Ruthie line shoes up by size. That night Josie stood in the doorway, watching it all unfold like some impossible dream. A place that had once held only grief now overflowed with purpose. Children healed. Grown men like Charles remembered what it meant to care. And Josie found herself believing again. Not just in second chances, but in miracles. She walked into the living room where Everett's photo still sat on the mantel, beside the letter she refused to move. She lit the lamp beside it, touched the edge of the frame, and whispered, "You built this." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle, quiet, full of grace. And somewhere far away, perhaps beyond what the eye could see, Josie hoped Everett heard the laughter, heard the footsteps, heard the soft knock of little hands against a door that would never be locked again. Because the grave he dug never filled. It bloomed. The end.